Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to Botany and Betrayal, the scientist turned spy with renowned historian and author Patrick Sparrow. I'm Jimmy Boyer. I'm the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Vice President for Education. And as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the New York Botanical Garden is located on the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. We honor them, acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. In addition to today's program, the New York Botanical Garden offers many classes, workshops, and public lectures in landscape design, horticulture, gardening, and more. I'd like to highlight a couple of these of our upcoming events. Our final winter lecture series takes place in Ross Hall on March 27th with Cassie Banning, who will present her work, Three Gardens on the Coast of Maine. On Tuesday, April 1st, John Salcido, along with the Ikebana International New York chapter, will present an O'Hara Ikebana floral demonstration in Ross Hall. And finally, join us in Ross Hall on April 19th for a floral face-off with Ace Berry and Kanan Marshall, followed by a special floral design workshop. Okay, on to today's show. Today is our special guest with historian, librarian, and author Patrick Sparrow. Dr. Patrick Sparrow is the CEO of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. He's an award-winning historian who has published widely on the era of the American Revolution. And he's the author of 4 books: Frontier Country, The Politics of War in Early Pennsylvania, Frontier Rebels, The Fight for Independence in the American West, 1765 to 1776, The Other Presidency, Thomas Jefferson and the American Philosophical Society, and The Scientist Turned Spy, Andre Michaud, Thomas Jefferson, and the Kentucky Conspiracy of 1793. It's fitting that today's talk is in our Mertz Reading Library here, since Dr. Sparrow was the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. He has also held positions as the historian at the David Library of the American Revolution, and served on the faculty of Williams College, where he taught courses on the American presidency, leadership, and the American Revolution. His first position after receiving his PhD was a postdoctoral fellow at the American Philosophical Society, where he spent 2 years surveying the Society's vast manuscript holdings and designed the APS Library's first digital guide. In recognition of his scholarly and administrative accomplishments, Dr. Sparrow is an elected member of the Royal Historical Society in London, the Academy of Arts and Sciences in Lyon, France, the American Antiquarian Society, and the American Philosophical Society. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Patrick Sparrow.
Thank you. That's very detailed. Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, thank you, Jamie, and thank you all for coming here. I'm thrilled to present on my book. The title is The Scientist Turned Spy, but the working title before it got accepted by a publisher was Botany and Betrayal, which, I don't know, I kind of still long for that. It's intriguing, and I'm sure it's intriguing to this group, being here at the New York Botanical Garden. So I'm coming from the American Philosophical Society. I might say a few words about the APS, because you may be wondering, why is a historian working for philosophers, and what does that have to do with botany and the history of science? So the APS was founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin and a group of other civically minded individuals, including one of the premier botanists of 18th century America, John Bartram, and also in collaboration with a New Yorker who may be familiar to some of you, Cadwallader Colden. They were all founders of the APS, and the idea behind the APS was to model an institution on the colonies off the Royal Society. The idea was that the colonies in the 1740s were beginning to lay the foundations for civil society, and they were building institutions to support civil society. And Franklin said we needed an institution to bring together the leading thinkers in the colonies. So somebody in Boston, and New York, and Charleston, and Philadelphia, they're all discovering things in their home communities. They're doing experiments in their home communities, but there's no way to connect their ideas together. So we needed to build an institution in Philadelphia, in the center of the colonies, there would really be a clearinghouse for the great ideas that were being promulgated within the colonies. And so that's why the APS was founded. Philosophy in the 18th century meant inquiry, especially inquiry into the natural world. It was only in the 19th century that it started to mean more metaphysics, Nietzsche. We like to say the APS is nature, not Nietzsche. And so we have developed over time a distinguished research library. Much like the Merce Library, we have 14 million pages of manuscripts. We have the papers of 7 Nobel laureates, so we continue to collect, especially in the history of science. And we have a very distinguished collection in the history of botany. As I mentioned, John Bartram was one of our founders. His son, William Bartram, we have one of the largest collections of his papers in late career drawings in the world. We also have the papers of Benjamin Smith Barton. Peter Collinson was an active correspondent with the APS. So the history of botany is a big part of the APS's collection and a part of who the APS is. And so that kind of leads me to this book, The Scientist Turned Spy. Because as Jamie mentioned, my position for a period of time at the APS was the librarian, was the title, the librarian of the American Philosophical Society. I was the director of this research library that had 14 million pages of manuscripts. And being the librarian was a great job. But at the APS, we have a staff in the library of 35 people. There are 9 or 10 different departments. So, most of my time as librarian was spent behind the desk. Jamie, as I'm sure big part of your job is, staff meetings, emails, all these things. But every once in a while, I got to get out from behind my desk and host what we call the Treasures Tour, where I got to pull out all these incredible treasures that the Society held and show them off to people who might want to support the APS. And I got to know this collection intimately, as Jamie mentioned, during that postdoc, where as the postdoc at the APS, which was before I went to Williams, I got to touch every document that they had before 1840 and create the first digital guide to the collection. So I really fell in love with this collection, and anytime there was a guest coming, it was always fun to try and curate a special visit for this guest. And it would always change depending on their interest. Maybe it was somebody who was an entrepreneur, maybe it was somebody that was in law. I could always find something to connect with them. But I always had one document, no matter who it was, that I'd bring out. And it was this document, the Michaud subscription list. And this document, as you'll see, was really the foundations for what became the book that I'm here to talk about. So let me tell you a little bit about what I knew about the Michaud subscription list before I wrote this book. So let me first ask, how many people here, and I know this is kind of a loaded audience, how many people here have heard of Andre Michaud before? All right, that's great. That's much different from most of the times I give this talk. All right? And I usually say he's the most underappreciated 18th century natural historian, especially botanist, and probably one of the greatest scientific explorers of the 18th century of his generation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is the Michaud subscription list. And this is how I would, if you were to visit me before I wrote this book, this is what I'd tell you about it. So first off, the top half of this document is in Thomas Jefferson's hand. Okay? Thomas Jefferson was an active member of the American Philosophical Society. At this time, he was vice president of the society while also serving as Secretary of State of the United States in the Washington administration. This is important. This was done in 1793. Jefferson eventually becomes the society's president. He serves in that role for 17 years. One of our later presidents, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit, was William Robbins, who was a director of the New York Botanical Garden in the early 20th century. So now what this document says, the first half is in Jefferson's hands, and what it says is, whereas Andre Michaud, a native of France and inhabitant of the United States, has undertaken to explore the interior country of North America from the Mississippi along the Missouri and westerly to the Pacific Ocean. Right? This is a proposal to do Lewis and Clark 10 years before Lewis and Clark. And one of the things I want to note is I've purposely added here a comma. Right? There's some words after this that we'll get to, but I want you to just remember, this is Andre Michaud, a Frenchman now living in the United States, has proposed to undertake an expedition to the Pacific Ocean. Here you can see the said Philosophical Society will take the proceeds thereof. So what that's saying is the APS is raising the money to support this expedition to the Pacific Ocean. And then beneath all of this manuscript in Jefferson's hands are all the early subscribers to the Michaud expedition. You can see on the top here, George Washington, $100. John Adams, the vice president, $20. Everybody always laughs at that. But Adams was a man of moderate means. He was not Washington. But in the middle, you've got Thomas Jefferson. Beneath him, and that's $50. Beneath him is New Yorker Alexander Hamilton. And as you probably know, he did $50 as well because he would not let Jefferson outdo him. And the truth is, if I can be a little snarky, is that Adams only gave $20, but I guarantee you Adams had that $20. Jefferson offered $50. I don't know if he had the $50, as we know. And then James Madison, he's the leader of Congress, the early Congress here. So what you're also looking at are the first 4 presidents' signatures. And this is believed to be the only document to contain the first 4 presidents' signatures on it. Now, what makes this all the more remarkable is that the Society only rediscovered this document in 1979 when a high school intern was going through an old vault, found a scroll rolled up with a red ribbon on it, brought it to the librarian's desk at the time, somebody named Whitfield Bell, who unfurled it and realized he had a national treasure on his hands. So as you can imagine, as the librarian, I love telling this story for so many different reasons, right? It's a story of our early history. It's Jefferson's connection to the APS. It's also about the discovery that happens every day in libraries like the one here or at the American Philosophical Society. I always emphasize research libraries or sites are laboratories for the humanities. Just like scientists have laboratories, botanists have laboratories, this research library is a laboratory for historians where new discoveries are being made, and this is an example of this. So I'd always get asked, so what happened? What happened? And I would summarize what the APS said on their website. Ultimately, the expedition was called off due to diplomatic difficulties with France, which owned much of the territory to be explored. So I want you to remember this. Diplomatic difficulties, that's about it, some troubles. And then France, which owned all the territory, all right? And we'll get back to that. So March of 2020, 5 years ago today, essentially, the world shut down because of the COVID pandemic, right? And as I mentioned, I've been librarian, and that was a heavy administrative job. It required a lot of my time focusing on things other than research, although I was a historian at heart. I always joke that I had this vault that just taunted me. Well, when the world shut down, I had my life back. I have 3 kids at home. When I got home after work, it was usually going to one sideline or another. All of a sudden, the world shut down, and I was stuck inside with 3 kids, but with a lot more time on my hand, frankly. And the director of development at the APS said to me, Pat, you give this great talk about the Michaud subscription list. We have an event in September in San Francisco at a club in San Francisco. Would you be able to take this little talk you have about the subscription list and expand it to a 20-minute talk that kind of tells a little bit more of this story for this event? And I thought, yeah, I've got nothing else to do. This sounds like a really good project. So I decided to explore this document. And I approached it with these 4 questions. Who was Andre Michaud? What is the real story behind the subscription list and its creation? What really happened? Is that correct? That single sentence that we had there. And then finally, did it matter? What's its legacy? And so I started to dig into each one of these 4 questions, and what was meant to be a 20-minute talk morphed into that 400-page book you see out there. And I'm now with you giving a 40-minute talk. And what I want to do in this talk is maybe give you a little sample of some of the answers I had for each one of these questions. Who was Andre Michaud? What's the story of the subscription list? And what happened and did it matter? Right? So who was Andre Michaud? This most certainly was not Andre Michaud. There is no likeness of Andre Michaud, which is remarkable given the amount that he accomplished. If you Google Andre Michaud, you may see some images. One of is certainly of his son, Francois Andre Michaud, who followed in his father's footsteps. There's another one that may be Andre Michaud, but is often attributed to Francois Andre Michaud himself. It's a pencil sketch, the one that could maybe be Andre Michaud. I can't say for certainty. It's attributed to Francois Andre. What you're looking at here instead is kind of the picture of Andre that I had in my mind as I did this research project. This was also discovered in the APS collection recently. We have the papers of a French botanist. They were largely uncatalogued, and going through them, we discovered this pencil sketch that he did of an 18th century French botanist in the field. And so you can picture here what it was like to go on botanizing expeditions. That's what they would describe him in the 18th century. Here you can see the pickaxe. That was the tool, the scientific instrument through which specimens were acquired. Over the shoulder are some of the treasures that were found by this botanist, waiting to be brought back and cultivated and studied at a botanical garden in France, probably in Paris, and over the shoulder a rifle, because you never knew who you might meet in the forest, but also because botanists were also what we would call natural historians. Many of them were also documenting specimens and animals that they found in the wild. And so that was likely used as well to acquire specimens for study and research in science. So this is what a scientist, a botanist in the 18th century might look like when they were conducting their experiments in the field. Now, André Michaux himself botany was not something he expected to pursue as a career. And I want to tell you a little bit about Michaux's background and how he came to be a botanist. He was born outside of Versailles. This is Versailles here. This is the main court, the palace, with the gardens there. This is where they had a botanical garden. There was a botanist on site here, and this is where the botanist operated. And that down here, this forest you see here was called Sartori. And in Michaux's time, it was not a forest. This was actually farmland, all right? And it was owned by the king, and the king would give out leases to those that were kind of favorites of the court. And if you had a farmland leased here, you had a very stable, reliable source of income. You were always feeding Versailles, so you had a stable market there. There were always mouths to be fed there. And then you could also market your produce, any excess, to the larger community surrounding Versailles. And so André Michaux, his family had one of these plots of land. And André Michaux's father believed that this was going to be his son's inheritance. And so he did everything he could to give Michaux a decent education, but always with an eye that he would return to the farm and just inherit it from him. And that was what André Michaux did for the early part of his life. He inherited the farm. He actually worked it alongside his brother. He married. He had a son, Francois-André Michaux. And then tragedy struck. Michaux's wife died just shortly after giving birth to their only child. And Michaux was sunk into a deep depressive abyss. All of his friends talked about Michaux's depression. They were concerned about his safety. They were afraid that he was going to do something drastic. And friends would invite him over to raise his spirits, to tell him there's reasons to go on. And this is documented in the sources. And nothing seemed to affect him until he happened to be invited over to the botanist at Versailles' house. And the botanist had recently received some seeds from foreign lands, and he wanted Michaux to experiment with these seeds. He said, will you see if these seeds might be cultivatable in French soil? Well, maybe it could be useful. They could produce new forms of grass that could be useful for agriculture. And there's other forms of seeds that we're getting from foreign sources that could transform French agriculture. So Michaux took these seeds, and what he discovered was this type of botanical work, experimenting, not just growing for the market, but experimenting and studying plants. The work consumed him, and it also consoled him. And soon he started to lobby and petition for more work. And what the botanist at Versailles realized is he had a remarkable brain, a genius at his hands. And so he started to train Michaux in the formal Enlightenment ways of botanical research and study. And soon he realized he had done as much as he could for Michaux. And so he sent André Michaux to Paris, to the Royal Garden, where he started training under the leading lights of French botany there at the Royal Garden, people like Jussieu and others. And then eventually they realized that Michaux needed even further training because they had a true gift on their hands. And so they sent him to London, where he could study in the Royal Gardens of London. He met with Joseph Banks, the head of the Royal Society and a noted botanist, all in his apprenticeship. And he returned back from London, and they sent him on a number of apprenticeship botanizing expeditions to the Pyrenees Mountains, all training him in these methods. And finally, in 1782, the chance for Michaux to really make his mark arrived. There was a French diplomatic mission that was heading to the Middle East. And Michaux lobbied for a botanist to be sent alongside this mission to conduct research for natural history. So not just botany, but also animals and other artifacts and specimens he may find. And Marie Antoinette agreed to underwrite his travel to the Middle East. And you can see here he spent almost 3 years traveling throughout the Middle East, all the way up to the Caspian Sea, and then back to Paris. And when he arrived back to Paris, he received a hero's welcome. he brought with him a remarkable collection of animal and plant specimens. He also brought back, to give you a sense on Michaud's brain, what is believed to be the first Persian to French dictionary. He also lugged back this remarkable stone called the Michaud stone that had some of the oldest hieroglyphics that had up to that point been discovered and weren't actually deciphered to the mid-19th century. And so all of a sudden the king realizes he has this gifted botanist who also has proven himself as a great explorer on his hands. And so King Louis XVI appoints Michaud the royal botanist. And Michaud thinks this is great. You know, his father had thought he was going to have a stable income being a farmer on Sartori. He's now got it as a royal botanist. As long as he follows the king's orders and continues to produce research, he's going to receive a stipend for life. And he says, this is great, and you know, this is going to change eventually. The king does not last forever. But Michaud says, you know, I've seen so many riches in the East, and I heard there's even more in the even further east. I want to head back further east to Southeast Asia. That's where the future is. And the king says, no, Andre, you're now the royal botanist, and French interests don't lie to the east, they lie to the west. They lie in North America. And so I want you, young man, to head west to the United States. Why? There are a number of reasons. So first off, much of eastern North America had largely been sealed off to French science because the British had controlled it. And as you know, the British and French were these deep rivals. And so French scientists had not had access to this area. And what the French believed is there's a number of crops that may be able to be imported into France that would help stabilize their agriculture, add to their produce, and really perhaps even transform their economy. So Michaud was to go over there to discover new plants that might be useful to French agriculture. The primary reason actually was more of a French strategic interest. The French had fought almost 30 years of war. If you think about the French and Indian War, called the 7 Years' War, that was 1754 to 1763, and then they entered the American Revolution and fought and supported the American Revolution. French forests had largely been depleted supporting the French military. The Navy, in particular, had demanded for shipbuilding purposes a lot of French wood. And so French forests had been depleted, and so Michaud's number one task was to discover American oaks that might be imported to French forests to strengthen the French military needs, to feed the military needs. And third was, if you can also find really interesting ornamental plants, that'd be great, so we can showcase things in our royal garden and the like. So that was Michaud's three chief objectives here. And Michaud was a reluctant to head here, but when he arrived, his plan was to open a botanical garden in New York. So he arrives in New York, 1786, and starts to explore New York. And I have to share with you Michaud's impression of New York. And I'm a historian, I have to rely on facts and Michaud's own words. So Michaud may have been wrong, but this was his impression. He said, those in New York are all cold. They don't really care about botany or science. All that they seem to care about is money. Right? He was frustrated, he felt isolated, but he did strike up a really close relationship with the French consul in New York, somebody named Louis Otto. And Otto told him, you might actually want to head down south. That's where there's greater biodiversity. And so for the French mission, I think you want to head down south. In the meantime, Michaud also set up a botanical garden in northern New Jersey, in Bergen County today. And this was a pretty remarkable accomplishment. It was on over 80 acres of land. And at the time, New Jersey outlawed foreigners from owning land in the United States. You had to be an American citizen. And so what Michaud was proposing to do was not just have a foreigner own land, but actually have a foreign monarch own land in New Jersey. Because it would be the French crown that would own this botanical garden. And so Otto, the French consul, happened to be married to the daughter of the New Jersey governor. And so he lobbied the New Jersey governor, and they said, and it's in the law and it's in the pronouncements, that the French had supported the American Revolution And this is us showing that we are still friends. This is an act of botanical diplomacy, if you will, to allow the French to open a garden in New Jersey. And this will also aid the United States, because anything Michaux discovers will also be useful, potentially useful to us. So he opens an 86-acre, if I remember correctly, garden in northern New Jersey, operates it. This has been well documented by that William Robbins, who was the New York Botanical Gardens director. He wrote a great article on it, published by the American Philosophical Society. Now, Michaux eventually does head down south. He explores the area of, first he goes to Philadelphia, where he meets with members of the American Philosophical Society. And what he says about Philadelphia, which is where I'm from, this is the greatest city I've ever been to, except for Paris. He is a loyal Frenchman, no matter what. But this is where actually the center of science in the 18th century was in Philadelphia, and that's what he really recognized there. The Bartrams had opened up one of the great botanical gardens in the United States. He had become very close friends with William Bartram, Benjamin Smith Barton, and the like. So he's really met a number of botanists in Philadelphia. He then goes down to Mount Vernon, where he meets George Washington, who himself is this great agricultural experimenter himself, and Washington even offers Michaux a plot of Mount Vernon if he wants to use it as a botanical garden. Michaux decides to head further south. He eventually comes to Charleston, South Carolina, and this is where he realizes this is where his home should be. The biodiversity in the South really overwhelms him. And so he ends up opening a 100-acre botanical garden in Charleston, South Carolina in 1786. So by the end of 1786, Michaux was operating 2 botanical gardens, one in northern New Jersey and one in Charleston, South Carolina. Pretty remarkable accomplishment. And then Michaux quickly sets into a pattern. Every spring, he sets out on a botanizing expedition somewhere in the American countryside. You can see here where he travels, all through the South. He goes down to the Caribbean islands, through Florida, all the way west to the Mississippi River. And then he'd come back and start to cultivate these plants in his botanical gardens to see how they grow, to study them, and to ship living specimens back across the Atlantic to France. So during his tenure in the United States, Michaux was credited with discovering over 1,000 new species of plants. He ships 50 to 60,000 living specimens across the Atlantic Ocean to France. And so once again, everything for Michaux seems to be going swimmingly. He was reluctant to come to the United States. He's now become enamored with the United States and what it offers. And then everything changes for him. You chuckled before. What happens? The French Revolution. His patron is deposed and soon loses more than just his crown, the head upon which that crown sat. So this plunges Michaux into really financial dire straits. His funding really has dried up. And he had he would receive a stipend from the crown, but he also could take out credit against the crown. And he could rely on American merchants and financiers to do that because they could trust the French backing. With the loss and the uncertainty with the revolution, all of Michaux's sources of income completely dry up. And so he's struggling with what to do. And at about the same time, he starts to receive letters from the French National Assembly, the revolutionary government of France, saying, Andre, we don't really have that much money. We don't have the money the crown had. It's probably time for you to head back. And Andre's saying, I'm the royal botanist. If I head back to France, I don't know if I'll keep my head. Right? So there's in his correspondence where he basically starts to pretend he doesn't receive these requests to return, Got waylaid, mislaid on the transatlantic. And he starts searching for new things to do. And he looks at this map of all that he's covered, and he realizes that he's seen most of Eastern North America. What's left? And he realizes it's Canada, which is also conveniently probably the furthest away from Paris that he could get, to head up to the Hudson Bay, which would make him one of the real first 18th century scientific explorers to venture that far into Canada. So he heads to New York, where he sells some of his goods, including some of the enslaved people that he did use throughout his research. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A. And then he heads up the Hudson River and all the way up to nearly the Hudson Bay. And he returns, and on his return back, he starts thinking, well, hey, I've accomplished this, but I really cannot head back to Paris. So he looks again at a map, and he says, well, now I've covered all of eastern North America and as far north as you could go. What's left to do? West of the Mississippi River, the Pacific Ocean. Because he, like so many other scientists in the 18th century, have heard about all of the promise in the West, all the unknown animals, all the unknown plants. It's an area of great potential. And he realizes that if he's the first person to make a transcontinental expedition, then he certainly will, his name will live on in the pantheon of great scientific explorers. And so he heads to Philadelphia, to the American Philosophical Society, because he knows the APS, this institution dedicated to science, just like the French Academy of Sciences, just like the Royal Society in London, might be the place to fund such a daring expedition. And so he arrives in December in Philadelphia. He meets with William Bartram, Benjamin Smith Barton, and he pitches them this idea. And they say, we know just the person who's interested in this, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson has actually been considering such an expedition since at least 1783. In 1783, he approached somebody named George Rogers Clark, the hero of the West, the person who had headed out and kind of, for the United States, conquered the west of the Mississippi River during the American Revolution. He had settled in what is near what is today Louisville, and he himself was a natural historian. And Jefferson thought, well, he has the skills to undertake this. And so Jefferson started to lobby the Virginia state government to underwrite this expedition. They said, we don't have the money for this. Jefferson never gave it up. 1791, 92, he tries to get the APS to find somebody with the skill needed to make this incredible daring expedition across the continent. They strike out. One of the people that volunteered for it was Meriwether Lewis, but Jefferson said he doesn't have the talent or the skills. He was younger in this period. So all of a sudden he meets this Frenchman who has now traveled all the way by himself, largely, to the Caspian Sea, all the way up to the Hudson Bay, traveling just with 4 or 5 Native American guides. He seems to have the skill and the experience needed to undertake such a daring transcontinental expedition. So Jefferson begins to mobilize money for this expedition and succeeds in raising the equivalent of $1.75 million in 18th century funding. So they raise the money. Michaud's thrilled. They start talking about the expedition, and Jefferson starts to think about that clause that followed that comma I had mentioned earlier, which they said, or in such other directions as shall be advised by the American Philosophical Society. So I want you to think about what that meant to somebody like Jefferson. That the APS, what they're saying, what Jefferson's saying is the APS raised this money for this expedition, therefore they can guide and direct this expedition. André Michaud had approached this as, I'm a Frenchman. Even though he didn't want to go back to Paris, he never renounced his allegiance. In fact, he'd been offered American citizenship and said, I don't want it. I want to maintain my loyalties to France. So Michaud now is saying, I'm going to be an employee of the American Philosophical Society. He's going to direct me on my scientific priorities. And who is this? It's the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, the secretary of treasury and war are the ones funding this. How is this going to look to the French government that I'm being paid by the government of the United States? So he starts to have second thoughts. Things get even worse when Jefferson organizes a group of the leading scientists in the United States, people like Benjamin Rush, Caspar Wistar. There's a committee of 6 that are composed by the American Philosophical Society, and they're tasked with coming up with the priorities for André Michaud on this expedition. And here you can see a copy, again, in Thomas Jefferson's hands, held by the American Philosophical Society. And I want to highlight 3 of their primary objectives here. The first, which they repeat several times in this document, is they observe to you that the chief object of your journey is to find the shortest and most convenient route of communication between the United States and the Pacific Ocean. So what's his number 1 priority? The fastest route to the Pacific Ocean between the United States and the Pacific. So it's a job for the United States to find the best commercial, this is for commercial purposes. How quickly can we get to the Pacific Ocean to open up trade routes and commercial ties? It's about the speed by which the East and the West can be connected, not pure science. Second, under the head of animal history, and remember, Michaud is primarily a botanist, animal history, that of the mammoth is particularly recommended to your inquiries. So find a mammoth. As it is also to learn whether the llama of Peru is found in those parts of this continent or how far north they may come. So fastest trade route to the Pacific Ocean for the United States' commercial interest, a mammoth and a llama. Now, the reason they chose these is a really interesting story. I don't really have time for it. I see the clock. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But the point of this is that for a botanist like Michaux, who's loyal to France, this to him is unacceptable. And he starts to pull out. And Jefferson and the APS and Michaux are locked in an extended negotiation. They're really at loggerheads, and it's pretty clear that Michaux is having real second doubts about this. And then once again, everything changes for Michaux when this gentleman on the left arrives in Philadelphia, Edmond Genet. So this was written at the end of April. Genet arrives in the first half of May in Philadelphia. He's the first representative of the French revolutionary government to arrive in the United States. And as you're all probably aware, the French Revolution has really created what might be the first foreign policy crisis for the United States and for the Washington administration. The French are saying to the United States, we supported you during your revolution to create a democratic republic. We're trying to create a sister republic. You should respond in kind. We have this treaty. You're supposed to support us in this revolution. And Great Britain and the other monarchies in Europe fear the French Revolution. They're fearful that this is going to spread this wildfire of democracy that's going to overturn tradition and monarchies throughout Europe. And so France and the rest of Europe, and especially Great Britain, are locked in a war. And the United States at this time still relies heavily on Great Britain for their trade, for their manufacture. And Great Britain also still controls many of the forts in the Northwest Territory, even though they're not supposed to. And Washington realizes that if he sides with France, it's very possible, if not probable, that Great Britain might simply retake the United States. And so he decides to proclaim neutrality, that the United States is going to stay out of this foreign war. Their ports will be open to both countries. Trade should be free, but they're not going to actually try and use their power to tilt the weight one way or the other. Edmond Genet arrives with orders, first off, to try and convince Washington to support the French through usual diplomatic channels, but to also perhaps use some unusual diplomatic means to maybe force the Washington administration's hands. He has instructions to mobilize angry frontiersmen in Kentucky to invade Spanish Louisiana. So this was controlled by Spain, not France. If you remember back to that original quote I said, they said controlled by France was actually Spain. To seize Spanish Louisiana, have Americans, Kentuckians seize it, turn it into an independent republic that'd be allied with France, with the belief that the Spanish and the British would see this as an act of the United States and declare war on the United States and force Washington to side with France. This is in the instructions he had. So Genet arrives in Philadelphia, and in a matter of days, he meets this French scientist who has this incredible track record of traveling throughout North America, and he has a current plan to head out west to conduct botanical experiments. And he realizes, I have the perfect person to implement this plot. André Michaux, my orders from the French government are to do this, and as a Frenchman, you have to follow these orders. I want you to travel out to Kentucky, pretend you're conducting science, meet with George Rogers Clark, that name has reemerged, who has indicated he's willing to renounce his allegiance to the United States, swear allegiance to the French Revolutionary Government, mobilize Kentuckians to invade Spanish Louisiana. And Michaux, once again, reluctantly acquiesces because he is a loyal Frenchman who's following the orders of his government. Now, Genet realizes, well, I've got the perfect person to do this, but a Frenchman traveling out there, that might raise some suspicions. I've got to figure out a way to really make Michaux seem like he's on legitimate business. And so he decides to approach the person who had become one of his closest confidants and friends in his brief stay in the United States, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. Jefferson, of course, had become something of an outsider in the Washington administration. He had begun to realize that even though he was Secretary of State of this administration, he opposed many of its policies, especially its domestic policies. And he himself was perhaps more sympathetic to the French cause than many of those in the Washington administration, who feared also what it may mean for the United States. So Jefferson and Genet strike up a very quick and close friendship. So on July the 5th, the day after independence, the anniversary of independence, Genet visited Thomas Jefferson's house. And this is what he said. Mr. Genet called on me and read to me very rapidly that he had prepared for Michaud to go to Kentucky, where he's going to speak of two generals who have proposed to go and take New Orleans. So this is the French ambassador telling the Secretary of State that he's planning to have some formal U.S. Generals invade Spanish Louisiana. And then he said he communicated these things to me, not as Secretary of State, but as Mr. Jefferson. What does that mean? What I believe Genet was saying is, look, we have our professional relationship, we have our personal relationship. I'm not talking to you professionally, not as Secretary of State, but as a friend, as Mr. Jefferson. So let's just keep this between us. So then he goes on, and he asked him for one other favor. He asked Jefferson to write a letter of introduction for Michaud, saying that Michaud is traveling under the guise of science, but has the full confidence of Edmond Genet, the ambassador. And here you can see what this is Jefferson's journal. I took back the letter of introduction and wrote another one. He wrote one exactly as Genet had asked him to write it. So I want you to think about this. This is the Secretary of State being told of a potential French plot to invade Spanish Louisiana, Spain, a country with whom the United States is currently at peace, in an attempt to force the United States into a war that it does not want to fight. And what does the Secretary of State do? He actually writes a letter of introduction that might facilitate this. It's an interesting thing to think about. I write more about that in the book. So what happens? Well, Michaud ends up heading west, having this letter of introduction from Jefferson and also a senator from Kentucky, travels to Pittsburgh, then down the Ohio River into Kentucky, where he meets with a number of Kentucky officials, many of whom are sympathetic to the cause, and then he goes to Louisville, where he meets with George Rogers Clark, who agrees to mobilize his those who fought under him during the Revolution, and invade Spanish Louisiana. This is now in the winter of 1793. The plan is to launch an invasion in the spring of 1794. Michaud then heads back to Philadelphia. This plot has not yet been outed. Now, meanwhile, while Michaud is out here and heading back, Genet then sends out to Kentucky some reinforcements, three French military officials. And they arrive in Louisville. Now, it turns out that one of these French reinforcements was a Spanish spy who quickly sends news from Louisville down the Mississippi to the governor of Spanish Louisiana, who sends news of this as quickly as he can to Philadelphia, to the Spanish consul in Philadelphia, who brings it to the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and says, "You will not believe what Americans are doing in Kentucky." He goes to Washington, he says, "Mr. President, you won't believe what's happening in Kentucky." And so this creates a crisis for the Washington administration. It creates a crisis of what can this new federal government, and particularly the office of the executive, do to stop such a potential invasion. One of the things that is the Kentuckians, I'm going the wrong way. One of the things the Kentuckians are talking about, Washington saying, do I have the authority to put this down? Does the federal government have the authority to do this, or does it reside in the states? There's actually a cabinet debate over where authority rests, whether or not the president has this authority. And there's somebody in his cabinet that says, technically, you can't do anything unless the governor asks you for assistance. And ultimately, Washington says, no, this is a threat to the Constitution. My primary obligation is to preserve the Constitution. Therefore, the federal government does have the authority, if needed, to suppress this potential insurrection. And he sends orders to the U.S. Army there, alerting them that if there is an invasion that is started from this area, that they can suppress it. But more importantly, he issues a number of stern proclamations saying anybody involved in this will be arrested and tried, and it makes those in Kentucky realize that the federal government can and will assert its authority. And so eventually what happens with this rebellion is it just peters out, which as a historian is a little challenging. It's anticlimactic, right? We've been building this near rebellion, and then it just kind of fades away because Washington decides to assert the authority of the federal government. So that brings me to my fourth question that I had, which is, did it matter? What's its legacy? And I'll just end briefly on that. I've gone a little long here. So I've talked about Michaud's legacies. As I mentioned, he had a remarkable record in the United States. He eventually goes back to France. I can talk more about that if you wish during the Q&A. Ends up in Madagascar, where he dies quickly, and unfortunately, his plan in Madagascar was actually to open up another botanical garden like he had in Charleston, South Carolina. The legacies at the APS, this really for our institution really helped spur our thinking about supporting science directly. We were then involved in some of the most important expeditions of the 18th and especially 19th century. We helped with the Lewis and Clark expedition when it happened. We were involved in the Long expedition. We helped with work going to Antarctica. We continue to support research today. Here you can see our Lewis and Clark Fund. We now support field work on all 7 continents of the globe. So even though if you were to visit us, an old historic institution, we really are still pushing the frontiers of knowledge. We were one of the first institutions to support research in astrobiology. In 2006, we created a fund to support research in life in outer space, which at the time was considered a fringe science and is now one of the most cutting-edge fields widely accepted by scientists today. So really, that is all hearkening back to Michaud. And we were involved in the 19th century in creating the first state forest in Pennsylvania, and it was named aptly the Michaud State Forest. The reason it carries Michaud's name is after he died, after his son died, the entire estate came to the American Philosophical Society, and we used those funds to help support the conservation of forests. But the last thing I want to end on are the legacies for the United States, which for me is the most interesting, particularly as a historian. So if you go back to how I came to write this book, I was just going to give a 20-minute talk that kind of gave an expanded discussion of this subscription list, but I started to dig deeper, and I started to go on my own expedition, or an archival expedition, living vicariously through Michaud that took me from this document ultimately to this document. And this is the first printing of the United States Constitution. It's Benjamin Franklin's copy with his annotations on the side, owned by the American Philosophical Society. And one of the things I didn't talk about was what this meant for the meaning of citizenship. And this was to me, the most surprising part of this. As Kentuckians were thinking about mobilizing an invasion of Louisiana, they had to justify their actions. And in the 1790s, the idea of being a citizen that was still a nebulous concept. It was a new concept. Many people had been born subjects to a crown in colonial America, which meant you had your loyalty to the monarch. What did citizenship mean? What were its duties, its obligations? How far did it extend? And those in Kentucky, and we have their actual debates, said as soon as we leave the United States borders, citizenship ends there. Our loyalties and obligations to the United States end as soon as we leave the country. And so if we invaded Spanish Louisiana, we'd be doing so as independent individuals, not as American citizens. And what Washington said is, no, that would be anarchy. If citizens, as soon as you left the country, could do whatever you wanted and potentially have your actions reflect back on our country, that won't work. Citizenship is, you have your duties and obligations to the policies of the government to which you are a part of. And so in 1795, in a bipartisan act, the Congress passed a law that helped establish the meaning and bounds of citizenship. That said you cannot mobilize an invasion of a country if your government is at peace with it. Only the government can do that. So it really helped establish the meaning of citizenship. And I never would have thought, when I started this expedition, this document, that it would lead me to such an essential question as the meaning of citizenship. And I think the last thing I want to leave you with is, this was an expedition that was sparked by just one document. And the APS has 14 million pages of documents. And I don't know how many documents you all have here, but I just think about all of the stories that are held in places like the Mertz Library and elsewhere that are just waiting to be told. So, thank you.